Okay, let's get started. Welcome everyone. Today we are very happy to have Anton KORINEK from University of Virginia to talk about something that everybody is supposed to know, at least to be aware of. Let's get prepared for the future of work. And we're also very happy to have JUELFS from NUS to discuss this great work. So without further ado, let's welcome the Professor Anton KORINEK to present his work. Anton, you have 25 minutes.
Thank you very much, Michael. And let me start by sharing my slides. Can everybody see them? Great. So this is a paper that's entitled Preparing for the Non-Existent Future of Work. We've all read dozens and dozens of articles and reports about the future of work, but the kind of condition that a lot of people don't want to take quite as seriously as I will argue we should, is the possibility that the future of work may not exist. And before I proceed, let me also emphasize this is joint work with my colleague at the University of Virginia, Megan JUELFS. So we have seen, especially in recent months after the rise of large language models, that there have been growing concerns that new technologies, and especially these fancy new AI tools, may substitute for human labor, and that has given rise to fears about technological unemployment. Now, all of this is happening after we have already seen decades in which the wages of lesser skilled workers in advanced economies like the US have been stagnating. And we have seen how such labor market disruptions can give rise to political discontent. Now we are facing predictions of even more transformative advances in AI, and that really adds new fuel to the question of will the future of work exist? So while we are discussing all of this, we are aware as economists that there is a very long history of fallacies about technological progress. So our profession, the economics profession, has in some ways battled the lump of labor fallacy that was advanced by Luddists for the past 250 years. And yet I will argue that maybe, although the lump of labor fallacy is clearly wrong, maybe the Luddists actually had some valid point. So the goal of my paper is to try to make sense in an economically rigorous way how to understand predictions about the potential redundancy of labor. Secondly, I will also ask the normative question, should labor be phased out if we approach such a world? And how should it optimally be phased out? And third, I will briefly tackle this question of how would we set up institutions that would prepare us for a future in which work may not exist. So the paper will kind of start with a taxonomy of the concerns about the non-existent future of work. I will first kind of emphasize the concept of labor-saving progress, which would be a first step in this direction. Second, the technological substitutability of labor. And third, the redundancy of labor. Then after this taxonomy, I want to go in an optimal policy analysis framework and analyze what should we do from a utilitarian perspective in the face of declining marginal products of labor. And then we will go into the design of real-world institutions. What are the underlying assumptions behind this paper? My starting point is that human brains, from the perspective of information theory, are computing devices. They take some inputs, they produce outputs, and this happens no matter what tasks our brains are engaged in, no matter if we are doing rote computation or if we are engaged in creativity, or the things that we really believe make us human, such as social interactions, emotional intelligence, and so on. All of it is information processing at a very fundamental level. And of course, that's also exactly what computers are doing, and in their most advanced form, AI systems. So there is now a growing chorus of researchers who predict that artificial intelligence will eventually surpass human intelligence in basically all cognitive tasks conceivable, and that it will still continue to advance. And if that is really true, and I'm not saying that's as a certainty, we don't know what the timeframes will be, but if it is true, it would really pose a severe challenge to humanity. It would also entail major economic harms, and those economic harms and how to tackle them are essentially the subject of this paper. So let's start with a brief taxonomy. If we are worried about labor being replaced, the first thing to worry about is the concept of labor-saving technological progress. Now we know since the Industrial Revolution, technological progress has been approximately neutral. It has benefited all factors of production roughly equally. And that's the reason why the living standards of workers have risen in tandem with economic growth. However, even when Hicks first introduced the taxonomy of labor-saving progress, he observed that there is no economic law that progress must always be neutral. So the concern is essentially that technological progress may reduce the demand for labor at given market prices, or in other words, an equilibrium may reduce the marginal product of labor. And as we observed before, there are already some harbingers of that. There are some categories of workers who have seen this happening for decades. Now, the most recent wave of automation, which is essentially cognitive automation, like what language models like ChatGPT are doing, is not likely to hit the unskilled blue-collar workers, but may hit skilled white-collar workers much more quickly. So this is kind of a picture illustrating the taxonomy. Hicks neutral progress would be when output here on the x-axis rises and the wage bill, W times L, rises just proportionally. On the other hand, progress that's biased against labor would be in the second panel. So after this kink here, when output continues to rise, the wage bill suddenly doesn't rise at the same rate anymore. That means progress is biased against labor. And then the third category, and the one we are really worried about, is labor-saving progress. Output is rising, but after the kink here, the wage bill is actually declining. And that is very much possible. It's just not what has been happening for most of the time since the Industrial Revolution. A second concern is the technological substitutability of labor. So one of the reasons why wages have gone up over time is that labor has always been a bottleneck in production. It has been, in the words of Baumol, the scarce factor that has held back the expansion of output, and it has suffered from this kind of Baumol cost disease. Now, this has always been true in the past, but if intelligent machines are really able to do everything, then it is not obvious that it will continue to be true. So technically, this second concern about the technological substitutability of labor is that machines may be able to substitute for any type of labor. You can think of L as a scalar or as a vector in production. In other words, for any input of labor in this vector L here, and any machine input, there could be an extra amount of machines delta M, such that the extra machines with zero labor can produce as much as the currently available labor in the economy. This is clearly not the case yet. So far, we have only been able to automate specific tasks. But if you take the computational perspective to the human brain, there's really no reason why it shouldn't be the case at some point. Now, logically speaking, concern 1 is neither necessary nor sufficient for concern 2. So in other words, labor-saving progress may occur whether there is technological substitutability or not. However, if labor really is technologically substitutable, in other words, once we have solved the technical problem, no matter what the cost of it, then add Moore's law to it, make these machines cheaper and cheaper and cheaper over time, and eventually progress will be labor saving. And that brings us to my, well, let me actually spend just one more moment on the predictions for when this may be happening. So the world's greatest technology expert on everything, Elon Musk, predicts it will happen in 2029. And there are also others like Ray Kurzweil. But some service of machine researchers are a little bit less sanguine and say it may be the mid-2040s. If we take kind of the computational perspective, then the computing power of the brain may be something like 10 to the power of 15 flops, floating point operations per second. And well, actually, the world's most powerful supercomputer is already surpassing that. And of course, Moore's law is still going on. So this brings me now to the third condition that we should be worried about, which is what I want to call the strong redundancy of labor. In economics, we don't just care whether something is technologically possible, right? We care about what is actually cost effective. And if you can replace me with a computer that costs $600 million, I'm not too worried because I'm a bit cheaper than that. So the real concern here is that we may be not just technologically substitutable, but that machines may be able to do everything cheaper. So the question is cheaper than what? First of all, cheaper than current wages. That would mean wages would go down. But secondly, it may actually be cheaper than human labor valued at its subsistence cost. So you will see the same technical condition for this as before. And let's assume that we express units of labor in days, and C0 is the subsistence cost that we use as humans. Then the condition here says again that anything we could previously do with labor can now be done with machines. And in addition, we have this inequality at the very end of the line, which says that the cost of the extra machines may actually be less than the subsistence cost of the labor that we are displacing. Now notice this condition, the strong economic redundancy of labor, is a sufficient condition for labor being, for progress being labor saving, and also for progress being substitutable for labor. So that means in some ways that's further in the future. And maybe that gives us some comfort. Now, I will emphasize there's also a weaker condition, though, what I call the weak economic redundancy of labor. Even if there are some jobs that remain, it may be that there are so few of them that the market clearing wage will actually be below the subsistence cost of labor. And that would yield the same kind of societal trouble as the strong economic redundancy of labor would imply. So there's a whole range of objections to economic redundancy. Some of them, I will argue, are maybe not the best arguments, and some of them are very valid objections. So I have listed them and I have kind of categorized. The first 5 are objections that you frequently hear when you read future of work reports. But I will argue they're actually not convincing. And then the last 2 are objections that I do think are very valid and that may preserve a potential role for labor in the future. So let me quickly go through them. First argument, it departs from historical experience. Well, yes, of course it does, but so did the Industrial Revolution, and it still happened. We can't rule it out. We also can't be sure about it. A second one, it's technologically impossible. Well, I will say that anything that information science and cognitive science has told us says that it's not necessarily impossible. It may take us quite some time. Some people say it may take us a century, but from a science's perspective, there is nothing that suggests it would be impossible. Economists often argue, well, that ignores the role of new jobs. So we know there has been a lot of literature in the late 2010s that talks about old jobs being displaced, new jobs being created. Well, if new jobs get created and humans are still more expensive than robots at doing them, if you have a general purpose, artificial intelligence, then those new jobs don't really help us, because we would still not earn a subsistence wage in a competitive market. So yeah, there may well be new jobs. That does not necessarily solve the problem of economic redundancy. A fourth point you sometimes hear is it ignores lessons from comparative advantage. Again, it's perfectly consistent with comparative advantage, but comparative advantage doesn't say that everybody will earn a living wage. It just says that the trade is gainful. It doesn't say that wages will be above a certain level. And then another argument I sometimes hear is the economy needs human demand, so how should it be possible that we displace workers? Well, it turns out that you can actually have a very well-functioning economy at different levels of investment demand. And in the limit, if these robots would take over, it would be conceivable that we have 100% investment demand in the economy, and the economy grows at a very healthy pace. So human demand is not necessary, although I, as a human, very much hope that we will still have the income so that we can express demand. So those first 5 arguments essentially don't hold water. The next 2, number 6 and 7, they are valid arguments, and they may indeed preserve a role for labor. So if we upgrade humans so that we keep pace with the cognitive capabilities of AIs, that means we could very well still earn a positive product. And finally, if we have a preference for humans performing certain jobs, even though they are technologically kind of outdated and redundant, I call it nostalgic jobs, that would also preserve a role for humans in the labor market. So imagine, for example, if we want human priests, even though we know the AI could tell us the same things or maybe even better things, then that would preserve jobs for us humans. Okay, so this is the taxonomy. I will now move on to how we should optimally allocate work and income in a world in which the marginal product of humans is declining. Let's start with a very simple case, the case of an individual which has a utility of consumption and disutility of labor. For simplicity, I make them linearly separable. And notice that I have introduced a subsistence cost of consumption for the humans. So if we don't consume at least C0, infinity, utility will be negative infinity. Let's assume that this individual has labor productivity or a wage of W if they work full-time, if they provide L equals 1 units of work. And let's assume that they also earn non-labor income, and this could be capital income or it could be a transfer in the amount of T. So then the first best optimization problem for this human, and it would also be the optimization problem in a competitive economy where the wage corresponds to labor productivity, would be simply to pick how much to work in order to maximize the utility of consumption, which is labor income plus the non-labor income, given the disutility of labor. And I will show you a graph to kind of illustrate the result of that. Let's first look at the left panel of this graph. If both the wage and the non-labor income T is less than C0, then this individual just doesn't have enough income to survive, and we will be in the Paris region here. On the other hand, if the wage rises above this threshold level, then the individual will work out of need at first. But then if we increase the non-labor income T, that would mean we move to the right and the individual would go into the region where they work out of choice. And eventually there is a reservation wage level W bar. And if the transfer T goes above that level, we will enter the do not work region. It would be optimal for the individual, both privately and from a social planner's perspective, to stop working, because essentially the marginal benefit of working at a wage below this level would not surpass the marginal disutility of the first unit of labor. So I see that time is passing quickly. Let me jump over the technical expression of all of this. And let's now look at the case of multiple workers who differ in their labor productivity. I will again ask the question, how should we allocate work and income to maximize utilitarian welfare if we have different workers with different productivity WI? And I will look at the problem of a utilitarian planner who just sums up the utilities of all these guys, subject to a resource constraint, which also encapsulates the production technology. So if you look at the very last part of this equation, you can see that I assumed that all these different individuals provide their labor weighted with different labor productivity levels into this production function, and they combine it with the machines that are available in the economy in order to produce output, and that needs to cover all the consumption of all the individuals. Again, let me show you a graphical solution of this problem. So let's assume all the individuals in this economy are lined up between W min and W max. And let's assume that here on the vertical axis, we have how much they should work. So if we start out in an economy kind of like the current one, then the optimal amount of work that a social planner would assign to these individuals would look like this. And you can see both the individual with the minimum productivity and with the maximum productivity are working here. And they're actually working an increasing amount. So the planner finds the more productive you are, the more you should work, because the more you are contributing to relaxing the resource constraint of the economy. The more useful you are, and therefore you're assigned more work. On the other hand, with a utilitarian planner, everybody is allocated the same level of consumption. Now, what happens if we have progress that reduces the marginal product of labor? Well, we may end up in an economy like what is illustrated with this dashed line here. So what you can see here is half of the workers are below the reservation productivity level W2 bar, and they don't work anymore. The planner has phased them out. And only those above that productivity level are asked to work, because this utility is still worth it from a social perspective. If we have further labor-saving progress, we may end up in an economy like this, where the planner phases out everybody. Again, I'll jump over the math. Now, oftentimes when we start thinking about the end of labor, we realize that labor is not only an exchange of work against essentially this utility, but there are also amenities of labor involved that we have to consider. So a lot of people talk about work providing identity, providing structure, meaning, social connections, and a whole bunch of other things. So let's include that in our framework, and let's say we have some amenities, AI, that basically scale linearly in how much we work, alpha I times Li, and alpha I could be positive if it's a positive amenity, or it could be negative if our amenities are predominantly negative. And then we add a linearly separable term x of AI to our whole utility function. So these amenities, they may compensate us for wage income to some extent, if they're positive. In fact, there is a compensating differential in the spirit of Rosen, that we can look at. And what I want to emphasize, for some individuals who really enjoy their jobs, it may be desirable to work even if the wage goes down all the way to zero. Maybe some people will still continue to do economic research even if they're not paid for it and they're earning a UBI. However, it seems like the majority of people is not really engaged with their work. And if they have the choice, given material circumstances, might not choose to continue working. So again, let me show you a graph, and you can ignore the proposition for what the solution in an economy with amenities will look like. There is now a two-dimensional frontier of reservation wages. And essentially, you don't work if either your productivity is high enough or if your amenities are high enough. You work if your productivity is high enough or amenities is high enough. And if both of them are too low, then the planner finds it optimal to phase out your work. Now,
so, we probably should stop here, but given the importance of the topic, I decided to give you 3 or even 5 more minutes to wrap up.
Thank you, and apologies for, I am almost done with what I really need to cover, and then I can kind of jump to my concluding slide. So there's, I think, one more economically really important consideration. So far, I have argued kind of from this perspective that an individual can always internalize all the amenities of work and can make a rational choice. But sometimes you hear people talk about we should intervene and we should either, some people say we should force people to work in order to get an income, or sometimes they say, oh, but it's good for people to work and they may not realize it themselves. So how do we economists frame that? And what I propose in the paper is the kind of only economically cogent way to phrase it is that there must be internalities or externalities to work. And in the fourth part of my normative analysis, I consider the case that we have such internalities or externalities. These internalities could be things like an individual doesn't recognize how much meaning they actually get from work. And if they stop to work, they may just stay in bed all day and become really depressed, but they can't rationally make that decision correctly. An externality would be, we all benefit from our colleagues and from the social interactions, but obviously, if I'm the only one who decides to go to work, and I guess some of us have that experience from the days of COVID when everything was shut, then it's kind of a little bit less desirable to be at the office. I think our perspective as economists, and that's really important in this debate, is we can let individuals make their optimal choices, but only if there are no externalities or internalities at work. And somebody who wants to argue for interventions in the labor market when work becomes redundant really needs to make that case. And that's what we economists should hold them to. So what does our framework look like if we add those internalities or externalities? Well, you can see it looks more complicated, but it's straightforward. And then ultimately, the social planner can, of course, see through those internalities and externalities and will allocate work in a way that it internalizes them. And mathematically, we can think of like a subsidy that corrects for the internalities here in the square brackets and that corrects for the externalities here in the bar terms, and that fixes everything again. All right, so I promised Michael I will jump to the very end. We talk about social insurance versus market mechanisms. I briefly talk about why we don't want a UBI right now, because we have much more targeted systems right now, but we may need one in the future. And my main proposal is that we should introduce a really small seed UBI now that kind of automatically grows as the share of labor in the economy declines, so that we don't need to have the politically charged discussions when we are in the midst of it. So we can act now while we are behind the veil of ignorance. And we could institute such a program at a really small level in a way that it automatically adjusts if labor really becomes redundant. And now I will jump to my concluding slide. Thank you for the extra minutes, Michael. So I've argued that we don't know, but we should prepare for the possibility that labor may soon cease to be the most important factor in the economy. And if that's the case, the allocation of income really needs to be separated from work. Otherwise, there will be widespread misery. But if we do successfully separate it, there is the potential for really large welfare gains and for unprecedented prosperity. So we urgently need institutions to provide social insurance for such a future. And we also really need to pay attention to the non-material amenities of work if the material benefits of work are diminishing in the future. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Anton, for this fascinating presentation. We wish we could have more time to understand, how should we deal with this great challenge. But let's see if Ben can help us have a better understanding about what we should be doing in the future. Ben, you have 25 minutes, please.
Okay. Can you see my screen? I think yes. All right. So start the timer so I'm on time. Thank you very much for asking me to discuss this paper. I think as you've seen, the paper is extremely comprehensive and talking about topics that I think are of first order concern for everyone, right? I think if AI starts to teach economics better than we can, we might start to feel a little more anxious. Okay, so I'll stick to not having so many equations, actually no equations at all in any of my slides, and just highlight some of the topics and take things piecewise. So I'll try to interpret some of the equations that Anton has in the paper, and just kind of boil them down, I think, to the core basic unit. And I'm going to try to push some stuff into the logical extremes just to kind of illustrate, what the statement is saying. So I think the first thing to do is actually, why don't we just ask the AI? Okay, so what I'm showing you here is a screenshot from ChatGPT. Those of you in Hong Kong or China, I apologize if you're unable to access it. I understand you have your own version that's coming up. All right, so we can ask it, what's the risk you become so advanced that you displace workers? Well, blah, blah, blah. It's called technological unemployment. It occurs when AI and automation can replace humans. Although it can increase productivity, innovation, it can also have negative impacts on employment, income inequality, and social cohesion. It's up to businesses and policymakers to manage the risk and opportunities of technological progress, ensuring that it benefits society as a whole and not just a small group of individuals and corporations. So I thought this is a pretty good discussion written by ChatGPT, okay? But what ChatGPT cannot do is take credit for it. So I will happily take credit for this statement that ChatGPT made. I think this actually summarizes the crux of the paper fairly well, right? Talking about, look, the capabilities become so advanced, but yet there are all these other things we care about, like redistribution, right? Working to actually get some utility or amenities, right? From working, as well as externalities like your social network and so on. And it also highlights some issues on redistribution, right? So that's what I'll be talking a little bit about as well. So to broadly summarize, okay, we can ask the question, right? What will happen to us? We thought that if robots became very good, we become, brains in a jar. But if the robots become good at thinking and our brains are then not that useful anymore, maybe we just become, right, just sitting pods like this, and they'll just plug us into the matrix. Although I understand, looking at some research last night, that humans would actually make very bad batteries. Okay. So the motivation is that, we have data and research from the past 250 years since the Industrial Revolution, and that's broadly showed that wages and the economy grow along a balanced path, right? In fact, the development of the Cobb-Douglas equation came out of looking at the data and realizing, hey, how come the labor share of income seems so stable, right? And yet the economy is growing. And so the only equation that can actually generate that was the Cobb-Douglas equation, right? But this paper says, what if that's going to break down now, right? I think as Anton said, there's actually no law that says we should be on a balanced path. And I think Philip Aguillon and co-authors actually have a paper that show even if you have automation always get better and better and better in terms of the share. So suppose every day 10% of your tasks can get automated, you can still remain on a balanced growth path, right? So at some level, we think the data is fairly stable, but it's only 250 years. We've been around for 20,000, right? Maybe if we had the real data generating process, we'll see a lot more employment destructing innovation. And some of the developments, at least in theory now, seem to feel a little like a knife edge case, right? That is, you'll only be stable if the share of automation is small enough, right? It has to keep diminishing and so on. So this paper says, okay, forget all that, forget how we get there, and suppose we're there, right? Suppose we kind of leap forward in some sense. This paper reads a bit like, like 1984 kind of science fiction a little bit, right? I think we agree we're not quite there yet, but we might get there at some point, right? 20 years, 100 years, or whatever. So what if we break that balanced growth path, then we might have machines can fully replace humans and can do everything better at lower costs, right? And the implication there would be there's less demand for labor, right? There are going to be fewer jobs for people. Now, if the wages are low enough and we don't earn enough transfers or other sources of income, we die. Okay, that's kind of, actually, the word Anton uses is much better, right? We perish. Okay, that's the official term in the paper. And the first people to be replaced are those with low job satisfaction and low wages, right? And then the paper then prescribes, from a utilitarian view, a UBI is preferable to targeted support once we get into that scenario, because everyone can potentially be affected by this labor displacing technology, right? So rather than try to induce people to work like the earned income tax credit, right, where it's a negative tax where you have to work in order to get that, you actually don't want to do that because, from a social welfare perspective, you shouldn't even work in the first place, right? Because your productivity is so low relative to the robots. And so in some sense, these results fall, fairly directly, I think, by power of assumption. Like, if you are not productive, then don't work, right? So that's kind of the statement that we get. And if you are very not productive, don't entice me to work, right? Just pay me not to work, in fact. And therefore, we kind of take a step into equilibrium logic now. When labor as a share of income, total income, GDP in the economy falls, well, at some point, tax revenues have to come from somewhere else. And again, this is a little bit by a power of assumption as well, because we're assuming labor becomes not so useful, and labor is way less productive than robot, and wages will fall. So we have to extract taxes somewhere. And I think, when I get to the discussion later, it might be more interesting to think a little bit more about where can we pull the taxes from to try to create the least amount of distortion. There's a bit of discussion on this, right? There's this part that talks about Pigouvian tax. Maybe I tax a labor replacement technological progress, right, in favor of things that just boost TFP, right? That affects both factors. But I think that might be worth discussing a little bit more. But, of course, unless you like working, then you should keep working, right? Like, I think, 10 years from now, Bernie is still going to be writing research papers, right? Because it seems he just really loves this stuff. And so I'll quote Voltaire here. The work keeps away those three great evils: boredom, vice, and poverty, right? So suppose we get rid of the last part, that is poverty, right? Because we have other redistributions and a UBI, there's still two remaining reasons to work, right? Because we're bored, right? And it just kind of puts us on a more productive spiritual path. Okay. I speak of that as a spiritual person. Okay, so I have six comments. They're fairly broad. I'll try to take these piecewise. I think the comments as a whole may not make that much sense because it's kind of going after specific parts of the paper, I think, in hopes that it gets a little tighter. I'll go through the first couple fairly quickly, and then spend a bit more time talking about, I think, the redistribution, welfare, and some of the missing pieces, or as applied micro people like myself would call it, endogeneity. Okay. Okay, so the first is that we had this balanced growth path in the data, and we have Moore's law. Okay, but let's break that and say that maybe the balanced growth path for the economy might not be enough, but let's assume still something that looks like Moore's law can keep going, right? That is the technology. I'm just going to assume it gets better, but now I'm not going to assume the economy will grow in a balanced manner, right? So then where will the distortion come from? Well, it comes exactly from the assumption that I'm making. It is worth noting that Moore's law actually it's not really a law, right? He wrote it, and I'm quoting Moore himself. He said he did not expect much precision in the estimate. I was trying to just get across the idea that there's this technology that had a future and could be expected to contribute quite a bit in the long run. It just seems to happen after the first couple of years where the number of transistors was doubling every 2 years or so, right? People kept investing more and more resources to actually discover that, right? And in some sense, people have argued this Moore's law thing has been somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy, that people have just been working to try to get at that path. There's also some discussion that maybe Moore's law is going to break, because at some point, you go so small, right? We are limited in terms of how small we can go before we go, subatomic. Okay, so, but nonetheless, I think we can still take the stance that robots can keep getting better. So the first thing I want to mention is it feels a little weird that we're going to assume going to make some assumption that computational power can rise forever, but yet the economic growth portion, right, may be somewhat limited or more distortionary. So I think you kind of want to make assumptions that are less stark. I suspect even with a weaker assumption, or weaker motivation, I think you still get most of the results anyways. Okay. The second comment is the framing of the paper. That is, we've made it sound like no work is bad, right? Whereas for hundreds of years, I think people have been working hard not to work. Okay. And if you think in standard neoclassical models, you have, TFP rises, actually prices of goods fall, right? The real prices of goods, like relative to wages. Some people are concerned about deflation, right? That's what Cathie Woods keeps saying, right? General AI is just going to make productivity so high that all the prices of stuff is going to collapse and your economy will break from deflation. Technology has been improving over the past couple hundred years. Indeed, the real prices of things like TVs have fallen, right? But not everything, right? Prices of other things have risen because this raises our opportunity cost. I think we could take some of the statements and actually flip it on its side to say, and this is also related to your concluding sentence in the paper, right? I'm quoting here Keynes from Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, and that is, we've been trained so long to strive and not enjoy. We do more things for ourselves than is usual. Okay, we should be doing that. We shall endeavor to spread the bread thin on the butter, to make what work there is to be done, to be as widely shared as possible. And so this is actually an interesting statement, right? Kind of takes some stance that there might be some good in working, so why don't we share the work? And that's actually not what the model says, right? The model pushes back on that to say, look, the unproductive people, just stop them from working, bribe them not to work, and have the productive people work. And then we have this, of course, the more famous statement, 3-hour shifts or 15-hour weeks may put off the problem for a while, right? That is, let's work less and less. And when I was preparing the discussion slides, last night at 11 p.m., I really wish that were the case, that we could work less and less, right? So kind of longing for the AI to help. So let's take a look actually related to the framing that maybe less work is actually a good thing, right? And then let's pay more attention to the redistribution. Let's also then look at the third comment, which is what does the data say now, right, on the state of AI? So this is not to say I think the results of their paper are invalid, but more about, is the premise reasonable, right? So how far away are we from that? This is a fairly new paper on experimental evidence on the productivity effects of generative AI. And so this is a RCT, randomized controlled trial, where they give some people access to ChatGPT and some do not get it. And they find that at least the current state of AI is such that ChatGPT substantially raises productivity, right? The time taken decreases by 0.8 standard deviations and quality rises by 0.4 standard deviations. Interestingly, inequality between workers falls because ChatGPT compresses the productivity distribution by helping low ability workers more. Okay, so for example, those who might not have good English skills, right? They can type some stuff in the ChatGPT and then it pops out an email or a report that's actually, like written in proper English, right? And then you send it to your boss, and then your boss uses ChatGPT also to summarize it back down into bullet points, right? So there's kind of this interesting world we're going to be living in. ChatGPT mostly substitutes for effort rather than complementing worker skills and restructures tasks towards idea generation. So that's a little bit of this kind of a new job type, right? Now we can think that people might start doing things like prompt engineering, right? That is, how do you write good prompts for GPT to actually generate something useful, and away from rough drafting, right? So even personally, ChatGPT has helped me to write the initial draft for a bunch of recommendation letters, right? I don't think it made me less productive or replaces me, right? But it helps me to actually get better or be able to write more letters in a year, right? With less time. So I think that's the state of the data now. So we might be fairly far away from the world that's been proposed in the paper. That's not to say the results are not valid. But it's also worth asking, GPT directly, will you get me fired? Okay. And it says, as an AI model, I do not have the ability to get anyone fired. I exist to provide information, answer questions. Okay. My purpose is to assist and support users, not to cause any harm or negative consequences. If you have any concerns, talk to HR. Okay. That sounds a little bit like, if a machine was trying to replace you, that's what it would say. Okay. But, that's the state. So I think, part of the discussion is just to share, I think, with the audience that, the state of existing AI, that's kind of where we are, right? So we want to keep this in mind when discussing some of the potential, social institutions that we might want to set up as well. The fourth comment has to do with the model. The model generates some corner solutions in terms of let's get people not to work at all. I think there's some value to attacking some of the standard assumptions people make. That is, when we, the first macro class anyone takes, we learn there are these things called INADA conditions to make sure you always get interior solutions, right? So even if you're very unproductive, you work just a little bit, right? Just so that you can solve everything by differentiation rather than to solve for kinks. In the baseline model, though, I do want to emphasize, it seems most of the treatment in the paper is partial equilibrium. That is, let's just look at an agent and look at how do we want to redistribute, but we still take a bunch of stuff as given. For example, these transfers. All right, there still hasn't been that much treatment on where does the transfer come from. There's some discussion verbally, but it's worth talking about, what sorts of taxation or revenue raising schemes would generate distortions or not. And, we kind of have some idea which would be appropriate. And more importantly, this stuff is determined in equilibrium, right? And so and I'll come to this in 2 comments time, but part of like how policies get implemented are almost like this political economy of what will happen, right? Or will people vote for someone who's going to tax the crap out of robots? I think that's worth thinking about, because that's where really the crux of the paper, when we start talking about what are the appropriate policies, I think we might want to think a bit harder about, how might we get there? The results are kind of nice. You get, consumption's independent of the distribution of productivity, right? So you equally split consumption to everyone. Everyone gets the same amount of consumption, but in some sense, some of the results are also a little strange. And I put strange in quotes here because whether or not it's strange really depends on your measure of welfare, right? And so far, the paper takes a utilitarian view, And as a consequence, we actually get that less productive people are happier because the only people that tend to work will tend to be the more productive people. In fact, as I mentioned before, you want to give transfers to people who are not productive so that they don't work. And that actually reduces labor supply and raises wages. I could see the dynamics here, but it's still a little weird because this remains a partial equilibrium statement, right? Labor supply, labor demand kind of falls out of the sky, not based on like some production function for the economy. And because that part is missing, it becomes a little hard to gauge, which is going to dominate, right? So you have these signs that we can derive, but in equilibrium, what are going to be the net effects? Okay. So I'm not trained in moral philosophy. So of course, I also asked ChatGPT. I promise this is the last time. What measures of welfare are there apart from utilitarian, right? So we have a bunch of others, those that focus on freedom, right? To be free to pursue their own interests. In that sense, this might actually be good to actually just give money to everyone, let them do whatever they want, right? Or Rawlsianism, right? That focuses on the least advantaged, the most disadvantaged members of society. And there's also communitarianism, which has to do with this social network. So it's a much more sociological type measure. So of course, different views of social welfare will give, I think, very different prescriptions. So it might be worth taking a more sociological approach to actually map which policies are most aligned with which welfare function, because we also know around the world, it seems like, we have different government setups because maybe people have different preferences also, right? So different welfare functions. Okay. In terms of the focus on distribution, I'm showing you here a plot from David Autor's 2019 AAA PNP paper. Looking at the wage distribution. And we're showing here that the skill premium rises dramatically, but that rise is actually coming from both higher wages to people with, quote, quote, skilled labor, as well as a decline in wages for unskilled, or at least for women, stagnant. So I think it might be worth mapping some of this into some of the discussion. Because at this point, for most of the paper, we treat labor almost as a class, right? That's, we have all types of labor. And I understand automation may, target one more than the other. And yet there's also a literature on skill biased technological change, right? And so it might be useful to actually break this increased productivity of machines and AI into these components, right? So Anton, I think you actually motivated it with AI affecting skilled people more, right? In some sense that, most of this discussion seems to be written by ChatGPT, right? And I'm just the one delivering the voice. And in 2 years, I may not even be required, right? And they're just gonna translate the slides directly into sound.
And in 3 years, that will apply to the writers of the paper too, right?
That's right. And maybe at some point, right, we can just, go gardening, right, or do whatever it is that we like. So if machines are taking over, so let's tax them, right? There's a little bit of this energy, but at the same time, machines are owned by people, all right? We call these people typically capitalists. And so there's a little bit of energy of communism or socialism. So I think we might want to explore that dynamic of the redistribution a little bit more. At this point, that part of the discussion is mostly in writing, but I think it's better to try to be explicit to say, if we tax in this particular way, here would be the consequences in terms of economic growth, and as well as inequality, right? And we can also talk about whether some policies may be socially feasible or not, politically feasible or not. Okay. So the last comment is that there's still some pieces missing if they propose, a bunch of different potential solutions. I agree with a bunch of them that, historically at least, like passing redistributive policy in America has been extremely difficult, right? And it's just I can't even imagine trying to pass some of the proposed policies like in the current condition now. And so I think the political economy of passing them it should be discussed a bit more. Anton mentioned maybe we start small and actually peg it to something. I think that's actually a really interesting discussion. That is, let's set a UBI as a function of what, right? So how should we scale up the UBI, and should it be targeted or not? So those different policies, what are the implications for inequality as well as growth for the economy? I think to do that, the model then cannot be a partial equilibrium. I think you then need to wrap it to be general equilibrium so you can actually get some more of these interesting dynamics. The second point is prices of goods are broadly assumed to be exogenous. There's some statements that you might have declining prices as production becomes more efficient, but actually in standard models we work with, we normalize the price of goods to be 1, right? And so wages are represented as real wages, and we tend to have real wages rise over time. And so that actually implies, goods get cheaper in real terms over time. And so it's worth thinking about which would change faster. Will the wage change or will the price go down? Right? Nominal wage go down or nominal prices go down faster, because this would be important to think about whether we can, get C0, right, subsistence, right? If AI comes and just completely decimates the prices, so everything is really cheap in order to just survive, then maybe, the phasing out or the quote, quote, perish scenario. I'm just trying hard not to get stuck in the perish scenario, right? So maybe we can rule that out, right? Where you wrap the prices to be endogenous and think about that a little more carefully. Next comment is thinking about this guidance. So there's some discussion of this. I would really love to see like an endogenous investment choice in here somewhere, to think about, how do we even develop the robots? Right, and which types of technologies should we subsidize or not, right? So this actually would be like a statement to, the NSF, right? To say NSF, stop funding stuff that would replace us. Let's fund stuff that would be more TFP-like. And how would we go about trying to implement something like this? The last comment I'll end up with is citing 2 Acemoglu papers that are from the same year that are published in different places that make slightly different arguments. Okay, I think only Acemoglu can do this. So developing the robots is endogenous, right? If we go to Japan, they have a bunch of robots, I think, not because they want to replace workers, because workers are inefficient, and workers are so crazy, robots are so crazy productive, but that they have no people. Right, and Acemoglu's Econometrica paper actually cites some decline of labor is due to automation, about 50 to 70% over 4 decades. But they also admit at the end of the paper that their model is static. No notion of capital accumulation, no incentives for development of new technologies and adoptions, and no scope for education and skill acquisition. Right, it's just a static decomposition of how much is coming from automation and a bunch of reduced form motivation. In another paper that went into RE Stud called Demographics and Automation, he actually states demographic change is one of the most important factors leading to the adoption of these robotics and other technologies in the first place. So in that case, the rise of what looks like machines that can replace us is generating from the fact that China's birth rate is 1, right? And so in 1 generation, the workforce and the population will collapse. Singapore is also at 1, right? We'll kind of go towards extinction at this level. And so then we need to then supplement that labor actually with the robots. So what we're observing is an equilibrium outcome that actually is beneficial and constrained optimal given the demographic choice. And of course, you can endogenize the demographics. But anyways, I think this is a very comprehensive paper. I'll leave this here. I think we have about 10 minutes for discussion, and I'll hand back over to Michael. I think it's an interesting thought experiment, but I think there's still worth thinking about. How do we get into that scenario in the first place?
Yes, thank you so much, Ben, for actually a very comprehensive discussion as well. And also, very entertaining, insightful. So, Anton, would you like to have kind of a quick response to some of Ben's comments?
Yeah, first, let me really thank Ben for the very thoughtful discussion. I enjoyed it very much. Just a few really quick reactions. in some places where it may be useful. So first, let me maybe explain a little bit more why I decided to go for this utilitarian setup and look at the first best optimal allocation. If this redundancy of labor really happens, this is going to be a crazy world, right? It's going to be very different from the world we face today. And that means I think we should really start, at least in our thought experiments about it, we should start from a blank slate. We should not kind of let ourselves be boxed in by the institutions that we currently have, because sometimes radical changes in the world require radical responses. And we economists, we have this really powerful tool, which is called first best analysis. So everything I do in the paper is first best analysis. I don't look at anything distortionary so far. And Ben is absolutely right that when it comes, for example, to taxation and raising revenue and so on, that's of course not the last word. But oftentimes I find the first best can kind of really guide us towards what is the essence of the problem, what we really want to look at. Having said that, so why utilitarian? I think the alternatives by ChatGPT, they were frankly not quite as appealing to our analysis as economists. The probably most compelling alternative for us economists is a kind of setting in which we weight different people according to essentially their net worth, according to their Negishi weights of describing a decentralized economy where people have different net worth through the lens of a first best. And so that kind of weighted utility approach with the kind of utility functions that we as economists usually use, maybe the most useful way of approaching it. I have a brief discussion of what happens in that case. Essentially, you want to phase out the richest people first for given productivity, because they are valued more in your welfare function, and you will continue to make the poor people work. One of the kind of really big lessons I took away is that the way our current society works is in such stark contrast to that first best. Because in our current society, we do kind of force the lowest productivity workers to work 2 jobs so that they can make ends meet. And the higher productivity workers at least have the option to enjoy a more leisurely life. And some of them actually do. Although I should say, Ben, I really appreciate you spending until 11 p.m. to work on this insightful presentation. I can tell that you put in a lot of efficiency units of labor, including with your augmentation, ChatGPT. Okay, now more seriously again, if we break up different categories of labor, of course, that's something useful to think about. I'm so glad I didn't do it last year, because when I wrote the paper, that was kind of before language models and ChatGPT had entered the public consciousness, and I would have gotten it completely wrong. So I'm lucky that I did not do it. And one more thing, Ben, you mentioned at some level pursuing this thought on what to tax and what technologies to adopt gets us into the discussion of which types of robots should we invest in, should we potentially subsidize. And I can strongly recommend another paper of mine on the topic. It's called Steering Technological Progress. And it asks precisely that question. If we cannot redistribute, how do we want to differentially adopt technologies in order to basically make them less labor saving or more labor using? And otherwise, I very much agree with all your comments. There's lots of directions for future work. And this paper actually was a book chapter for the Handbook of AI Governance. And then later on, I added all the mathematical and economic formulaic analysis to make it kind of useful, I hope, for economists as well. But thank you again.
Great. Let's take a few questions from the floor. If you have questions, please give me a signal or just raise your hand. Oh yeah, Paul, please.
No, I think Bernie posted his question, right?
Oh yeah, okay. Let's start with Bernie's question. Anton, do you read the question? So basically, the question is really about endogenous fertility rate. If you forecast that there will be a change in relative factor price, then it's possible to put it into the model in a full-fledged general equilibrium model.
Yeah, so I think if we look at the historical relationship between, I suppose, technological progress, or let's say wealth levels and birth rates, there is a clear negative relationship, right? There are additional factors, like let's say, for example, the really high real estate prices in Singapore, or the one-child policy in China, and so on. But overall, there is a negative association. Now, I would say if we enter this world of redundant labor, this would be such a radical change that I'm not confident we can believe that the same kind of correlation will continue. If it does, it would suggest our birth rates will plummet to like extremely low rates, because an economy in which labor is redundant would be an economy in which capital is extremely, extremely productive. But I'm not quite sure we can make that conclusion. I think it would be such an extreme regime shift that the old laws may no longer necessarily apply.
May I add a little bit?
Please.
So I think, I'm just drawing on Gary Becker's lectures, right? The shadow price of having children is actually your wage, right? And if you're not working anymore and you're more leisurely, the cost to have children actually falls. And so we might actually see the birth rate rise, right? Like, for example, during COVID and I was working from home, I generated 2 children.
Congratulations.
Right. And so this is what we mean. Maybe we have more leisure, there might actually be more of us, right? Because the opportunity cost of time, our time actually would fall.
Right. If there is no more question, let me just abuse my power of being a chair and asking the very last question. I think the utilitarian approach can be well justified in the sense that we really don't know what's going on. So if there is such a dramatic and transforming technological progress, and then there will be a lot of revolutionary powers to reshuffle the current institutions. But I still want to box ourselves in the current institutions and ask the following question: say, given all the externalities and internalities that you mentioned kind of towards the end of your presentation, suppose we have that, and suppose we stay in the current institutions and try to figure out, say, tax and transfer policies. Is there any way that we can do, say, suppose there are a lot of externalities for us to stay in office, forget about all the geopolitical tensions and superpower competitions. Suppose we are in a closed economy, and is it possible to design kind of optimal policy to slow down a bit the progress of robots and try to internalize the externalities for us to survive? So is there any thoughts along that line, or?
Yeah, so I think if there really are very significant externalities to work, then the optimal thing is to subsidize work, right? We don't want to change the speed of progress. We just want to subsidize the work. And that's conceivable. I'll have to tell you, so once I started working a little bit on this externalities and internalities framework, I started to veer towards the perspective that these externalities are probably not as large as a lot of people claim, because many benefits will probably be something that we can obtain through other mechanisms than work. So let's say if it's social connections, I'm sure we can find other ways of connecting socially rather than forcing people to work. But if it is structure, I hope we can find other ways of imposing structure on people than forcing them to work. And I came away with an actually relatively libertarian perspective on labor market policies. I don't think we should lock ourselves into a future where we force everybody to work to get their benefits just because that's how the society was organized in the past. But that's where I tend to go. I would say I'm open to being convinced otherwise.
So Bernie put quite a few comments or questions into the box, but I'm afraid, we don't really have time. So let's just try to wrap up. Before I end this very stimulating webinar, I want to make an announcement. On April the 5th, we will have a webinar on anonymous loan applications presented by Ran Tianyue from NUS. So hope to see you all again in our next meeting. And let me thank you again for participating in this great webinar. See you soon.